Hello, Belle. How are we doing today? So here's chapter 12, The Rescue. Lewis liked to sleep on the lake. After all, he's a swan. At night, after blowing taps, he'd waddle down to the sandy beach by the dock. There he'd take off his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet. He hides them under a bush. Who's going to take him? Then he shoved off into the water. And as soon as he was afloat, he'd tuck his head under his wing. For a while, he would doze off and think about home and his mom and dad. And then he'd think about Serena, how beautiful she was, and how much he loved her. Pretty soon, he'd be fast asleep. When daylight would come, he'd swim to shore, have a light breakfast of water plants and green things that grew in the lake. And then he'd put on his things, climb onto the flat rock, and blow reveille, waking up all the campers. And then he'd rush to the dock and have a swim, along with all the other campers. And after supper at night, the campers would play volleyball. Lewis loved volleyball. He couldn't hop around as fast as the boys could, but boy, could he reach out quick with his long neck and poke the ball in the air over the net. If you've never seen a swan playing volleyball, well, here's the drawing of it. See in there? Pretty cool. And it was hard to get the ball past Lewis. He could get his neck out and return almost any shot. And when the boys chose sides to start the game, Lewis was always the first one to be chosen. The boys loved life at camp in Ontario, Canada. They learned how to swim and how to handle a canoe, and Sam Beaver took them on nature walks and taught them how to sit quietly on a log and observe all the wild creatures and the birds. He showed them how to walk in the woods without making a lot of noise. He showed them where the kingfisher had his nest, a hole in the bank by the stream. He showed them the partridge and her little chicks. And when the birds heard a soft cuckoo, 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 Sam told them they were listening to the saw-whet owl, the smallest of owls, no bigger than a man's hand. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the whole camp would wake up to the scream of a wildcat. No one ever saw a wildcat, but his scream was heard many nights. One morning when Sam was playing tennis with Applegate and Skinner, Sam heard a clanking noise. He looked behind him, and there coming out of the woods was a skunk. Well, the skunk's head was stuck in a tin can, and he couldn't see where he was going. He kept bumping into the trees and the rocks, and the can went clank, 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 clank. That skunk is in trouble, said Sam, laying down his tennis racket. He's been to the dump looking for food. He poked his head into that empty can, and now he can't get it out. Uh-oh. Well, the word spread quickly throughout the camp that a skunk had arrived, and the boys came running to see the fun. Mr. Brickle, the camp counselor owner, told them not to get too close. The skunk might squirt them with stinky perfume. So the boys danced around, keeping their distance and holding their noses. The big question was how to get the can off the skunk without getting squirted. He's going to need help, said Sam. That skunk will starve to death if we don't get that can off. Well, all the boys had bright ideas. One boy said they should make a bow and arrow, tie a string to the arrow, and shoot the arrow at the can. Then when they hit the can, they could pull the string and the can would come off the skunk's head. Well, that didn't sound like a good idea. Another boy suggested that two boys climb a tree, and one boy could hang by his feet from the other boy's hands, and when the skunk walked under the tree, the boy who was hanging by his feet could reach down and pull the can off, and if the skunk squirted, the perfume wouldn't hit the boy because he'd be hanging in the air. Well, that didn't seem like a good idea either. Even Mr. Brickle didn't like that one. He said it was extremely impractical and dangerous, and he would not permit it. Another boy suggested they get a block of wood, smear it with glue, and when the skunk knocked against it, the can would stick to the block of wood. Well, that didn't sound too good either. Besides, they didn't have any glue. While everybody was making suggestions, Sam Beaver walked quietly into his tent. He returned a few minutes later with a long pole and a piece of fishing line. He tied one end of the fishing line to the pole, which is what you usually do with a fishing line, right? Then he tied a slip knot in the other end of the line and formed a noose. He climbed to the roof of the porch and asked the other boys not to get too close to the skunk. But this time the skunk was bumping all over the place, clunk, clunk. It was a pitiful sight. Sam, holding his pole, waited patiently on the roof. He looked like a fisherman waiting for a fish to bite. But when the skunk came close to the building, Sam reached over and dangled the noose in front of the skunk, slipped the noose around the can, and gave a jerk. The noose tightened and the can came off. And so it did. And the skunk turned around and squirted right at Mr. Brickle, who jumped back, stumbled, and fell. All the boys danced around holding their noses. The skunk ran off into the woods. Mr. Brickle got up and dusted himself off. The smell smelled bad, and Mr. Brickle smelled too. "Congratulations, Sam," said Mr. Brickle. "You have aided a wild creature, and you have given Camp Couscous a delicious dash of wild perfume. I am sure we will remember this stink for a long time to come." "I don't see how we can very well forget it." "Caw-caw!" cried Lewis, lifting his trumpet, and the lake echoed with the sound. The air was heavy with the rich, musky smell of the skunk. The boys danced and danced, holding their noses. Some held their stomachs, pretending to throw up. Then Mr. Brickle announced it was time for the morning swim. "A swim will clear the air," he said, and he walked away towards his cottage to change his clothes. After lunch each day, the campers went to their tents for a rest period. Some of them read books, some wrote letters home, some of them telling their parents how bad the food was, and some just laid there and talked. One afternoon during rest period, the boys in Applegate's tent began teasing him about his name. "Applegate Skinner," said one boy. "Where did you get such a crazy name, Applegate?" "My parents gave it to me," replied Applegate. "I know what his name is," said another boy. "Sour Applegate Skinner." And the boys howled and began chanting, "Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate." "Quiet," bellowed the tent leader. "I don't think it's funny," said Applegate. "His name isn't Sour Applegate," whispered another boy. "His name is Wormy Applegate. Wormy Applegate Skinner." Well, this suggestion was greeted with screams of laughter. "Quiet," bellowed the tent leader. "I want quiet in this tent. Leave Applegate alone." "Leave rotten Applegate alone," whispered another boy, and some of the other boys had to pull their pillows over their heads so the snickering couldn't be heard. Applegate was very sad. When the rest period was over, he wandered down to the dock. He didn't like to be made fun of, and he wanted to do something to get even. Without saying anything to anyone, he slid a canoe into the water and paddled out into the lake, heading for the opposite shore over a mile away. No one noticed him. Applegate had no business taking a canoe out alone. He had not even passed his swimming test, and he didn't pass his canoe test. He was disobeying a camp rule. When he was about a quarter away from shore in deep water, the wind blew very strong, and the waves got higher. The canoe was hard to manage. Applegate got scared. Suddenly, a wave caught the canoe and spun it around. Applegate leaned hard on his paddle, and his hand slipped. He lost his balance, and the canoe tipped over. Applegate found himself in the water. His clothes felt terribly soggy and very heavy, and his shoes dragged him down. He could barely keep his head above the water. Instead of hanging on to the canoe, he started swimming towards the shore, which was a crazy thing to do. Always stay with the boat. It will float. One wave hit him square in the face and he got a mouthful of water. "Help!" he screamed. "Help me! I'm drowning. I'll give the camp a bad name if I drown. Help! Help!" Well, the counselors heard him and sprinted toward the waterfront. They jumped into canoes and rowboats and started for the drowning boy. One counselor kicked his moccasins off, dove in, and began swimming towards Applegate. Mr. Brickle raced to the dock, climbed to the diving tower, and directed the rescue operations, shouting through a megaphone. "Hang on to the canoe, Applegate," he shouted. "Don't leave the canoe." But Applegate had already left the canoe. He was all alone, thrashing about, wasting his strength. He was sure he would go to the bottom and drown. He felt weak and scared. Water had gotten into his lungs. He couldn't last much longer. The first boat to get away from the dock was rowed by Sam Beaver. Sam was pulling hard at the oars, straining every muscle, but things didn't look good for Applegate. The boats were still a long way from the boy. When the first cry of help was heard in the camp, Lewis was coming around the corner of the main lodge. He spied Applegate and immediately responded to the call. "I can't fly out there," thought Lewis, "because my flight feathers have been falling out lately. But I can certainly make better time than those boats." Dropping his slate, his chalk pencil, his trumpet, Lewis splashed into the water and struck out, beating his wings and kicking with his webbed feet. A swan, even in summer when he can't fly, can scoot across the water at high speed, and Lewis's powerful wings beat the air. His feet churned the waves as if he was running on top of the water. In a moment, he'd passed all of the boats. When he reached Applegate, he quickly dove, pointed his long neck between Applegate's legs, and came to the surface with Applegate sitting on his back. Now there is a sight. Do we see that? Oh boy. Cheers came from the people on the shore and in the boats. Applegate clung to Lewis's neck. He'd been saved in the nick of time. Another minute and he would have gone to the bottom. He would have been a goner. "Thank God," shouted Mr. Brickle through his megaphone. "Great work, Lewis. Camp Couscous will never forget this day." And a pause. "Great work, Lewis," said Mr. Brickle. "Camp Couscous will never forget this day. The reputation of our camp has been saved. Our record for safety is still untarnished." Lewis didn't pay much attention to all the shouting. He swam very carefully over to Sam's boat, and Sam pulled Applegate into the boat and helped him into the stern seat. "You look pretty funny riding a swan," Sam said, "and you're lucky to be alive. You're not supposed to go out alone in a canoe." But Applegate was too scared and too wet to say anything. He just sat and stared straight ahead, spitting water out of his mouth and breathing pretty hard. At supper that night, Mr. Brickle placed Lewis at his right-hand side, in the place of honor. When the meal was over, he rose and made a speech. "We all saw what happened on the lake today. Applegate Skinner broke a camp rule, took a canoe out alone, and was upset. He was drowning when Lewis the Swan, rapidly outdistancing all the other campers, reached his side, held him up, and saved his life. Let us all give a standing cheer to Lewis." And the boys and the counselors all stood up, and they cheered and clapped and beat on the tin plates with the spoons, and then they all sat down. And Lewis, he looked quite embarrassed. Here's that picture. The boys and the counselors were very happy. Lewis was continuing to be embarrassed. "And now, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle, I hope the rescue has caused you to change your opinion of birds. The first day you were here in the camp, you told us you didn't care for birds. How do you feel now?" "I feel a little sick," said Applegate. "That makes you sick to your stomach to almost ground? My stomach still has a lot of lake water in it." "Yeah, but what about birds?" said Mr. Brickle. Applegate thought hard for a moment. "Well," he said, "I'm grateful to Lewis for saving my life, but I still really don't like birds." "Really?" said Mr. Brickle. "That's quite remarkable. Even though a bird saved you from drowning, you don't care for birds. What have you got against birds?" "Nothing," said Applegate. "I have nothing against them. I just don't care for birds." "Okay," said Mr. Brickle. "I guess we'll have to leave it at that. But the camp is proud of Lewis. He is our most distinguished counselor, a great trumpet player, a great bird, a powerful swimmer, a fine friend. He deserves a medal. In fact, I intend to write a letter recommending that he be given the life-saving medal." And Mr. Brickle did as he promised. He wrote a letter, and a few days later a man arrived from Washington. Washington does good stuff, huh? With the life-saving medal. All the while the campers watched, and he hung the medal around Lewis's neck, alongside the trumpet, the slate, and the chalk pencil. That neck of Lewis's better be long, because it's got a lot of stuff there. And it was a beautiful medal, and it had engraving on it. There's Lewis with his medals. His medal, his trumpet, his chalk, his pencil. Oh! To Lewis, the Swan, who with outstanding courage and complete disregard for his own safety saved the life of Applegate Skinner. Lewis took off the slate and wrote, "Thank you for this medal. It is a great honor." But he began to think to himself, "I'm beginning to get overloaded with stuff around my neck. I got a trumpet, a slate, a chalk pencil, and now I got a medal. I'm beginning to look like a hippie. I still hope I'll be able to fly when my flight feathers grow in again." That night, when darkness came, Lewis blew the most beautiful taps he had ever blown. The man who had brought the medal from Washington was listening and watching. He could hardly believe his ears. And when he returned to Washington, he told people what he had seen and heard. Lewis's fame was growing. His name was well known. People all over were beginning to talk about the Swan who could play a trumpet. How about that?